The hate era of Thomas and Friends has had a lot of hate from the Thomas fandom, though there are some episodes that stand out from the rest, and Season 8 has had many fans lighten up on it. Episodes like Respect for Gordon, Percy and the Oil Painting, Emily and the Special Coaches, and Hector the Horde have all earned quite a bit of praise in recent years. In addition, many of us have grown up with the hate era, leading us to feel nostalgic for it. But an episode I feel doesn't get enough attention is Edward the Great. This episode may seem like a standard hit era bore, and receives much flack from fans.
Edward is a waste of steam.
But due both to childhood memories and a better understanding now that I'm older, this episode has become one of my favorites in the hit era. Let's look a little deeper, shall we? As with most hit era episodes, we begin with an introduction to our main protagonist. We are told that Edward sometimes feels left out due to his age.
But Edward is old, and not as strong as the other engines. So sometimes Edward feels left out.
Whoa, back up.
Edward feels left out.
As it says old and left out, we see both Henry and Edward. Did this episode literally predict Bwaba? We then cut to the Duke and Duchess of Boxford and learn they will be visiting their new summer house. This means Spencer would be transporting them there. Now when I first saw this episode, it was brand new to me. At the time, I never really watched the episodes featuring the season 7 characters because I didn't own them. You can imagine my excitement when it showed the Duke and Duchess and I was like, hold on, could it be? And there was Spencer and I got so excited. I'm not sure if this was intentional on the writer's part, but it definitely worked. We now get into the story as Spencer arrives in Natford.
You have beaten Gordon's record! Of course, boasted Spencer. I'm faster and finer than all the engines on Sodor put together.
Gordon comments that Spencer is just a big old show-off, and everyone agrees. The Fat Controller announces that Spencer will take the Duke and Duchess, with another engine carrying their furniture. All the other engines want to use this opportunity to race Spencer, but he instead chooses Edward. But here, James and Gordon both start bashing on Edward.
Fancy sending a back engine to do an express engine's job, sniffed Gordon.
So I gotta take the tube from there and put it down here. Right over there.
Put it down there?
Yeah, I'm gonna use that after a while. That's a cute little tube.
Yeah.
However, Thomas and Percy jump in to defend him and roast Spencer.
Spencer has a bigger boiler, said Thomas, but that just means more hot air.
Wait a sec, haven't we heard this before?
He's a steam engine, but he's still full of hot air.
And that's not the only callback we have here. This clip reminds me of Old Iron when James again is bashing on Edward.
Old Iron? Slow? Why, Edward could beat you in a race any day.
So, Edward begins his journey, only for Spencer to pass him right away. Following this, Edward starts up the hill and... Hold up, I want to mention some things here. In the original version of the episode, there was going to be a scene where Edward passes Spencer at the water tower, only for Spencer to pass him again. Funny, as this is just before Gordon's hill. Maybe Spencer remembered Gordon's advice from before.
Don't forget the water.
And I might as well acknowledge it now that this episode is a retelling of the classic Aesop fable, The Tortoise and the Hare. Spencer doesn't think Edward stands a chance against him, and he is very overconfident. Also, in another deleted scene, Donald and Douglas were supposed to appear and cheer Edward on.
Hooray for Edward! Cried Donald. He's a first-rate engine! Added Douglas.
Edward works hard to climb up the hill, but speeds up on the descent and gets a boost of confidence from seeing Spencer in the distance. Later, Edward passes Spencer again when he's at Wellsworth. The staff cheer Edward on, but Spencer passes him again when the Duke and Duchess finish their tea. As he passes Edward, he has the nerve to steal Gordon's catchphrase.
Fastest and best.
Later, he stops again so the Duke and Duchess can take some pictures. Meanwhile, Spencer falls asleep in his carelessness. We next see Gordon passing Spencer in the opposite direction. Somehow. The hate era engines always seem to be able to randomly teleport, don't they? As Gordon passes Spencer, he realizes that Edward's losing. And here's where a lot of fans criticize the episode for having Gordon say this.
Edward is a waste of steam.
This goes against a lot of Gordon's recent character growth in earlier seasons. But...
A minute ago, I didn't use that little tube.
What are you gonna do?
I gotta use that tube now.
Gordon isn't bashing on Edward out of nowhere. He's crossed about his record being beat. That's why he wanted to race Spencer so much, so he can prove he's still better than him. Why else would Gordon be so hopeful to pull freight? But I don't think he really means it. This is proven when he sees how hard Edward is working and regrets his previous statement. So instead, he calls out encouragement.
Well done, Edward. You are a credit to the railway.
Something I want to point out is Edward's reaction to this. While he was encouraged by others before, Gordon stands out. The reason his praise strikes home is because he used to be the engine who would bash on Edward the most. In fact, he's been putting him down since he first came to the railway. So for him to back up Edward now is high praise, and a testament to how much he has grown. This final boost of support fills Edward with joy and new strength. Edward passes Spencer one last time as the Duke and Duchess reboard the train, but because he's asleep, he doesn't notice Edward is passing until it's too late. He immediately speeds up to try to beat Edward, but the track is too old for his weight.
I'm an express engine, I don't go slow.
And as he crawls along, it is pushed further and further into Spencer's mind that he has lost the race. This is the ultimate humiliation for him. Not only was he beat by someone who shouldn't stand a chance against Gordon, his greatest rival, but an old geezer. People tend to say that in this episode, Edward is in that stupid, weak, and pathetic portrayal, but I wholeheartedly disagree. If this was the same character we saw in Saving Edward or Edward in the Mail, he would be moaning about how he's too weak. But no, instead he says this.
We'll do my best, he puffed.
This is much more akin to when he pushed Gordon up the hill, when he chased James down, and when he pulled a full train through a storm on one axle. He knows Spencer has a great advantage, but that advantage won't keep him from trying. He always keeps going, no matter the circumstances. Edward never gives up, even when it's tough, and when he has the support of his friends, there's nothing that can stop him. And I'd say this episode shows that almost as well as any classic episode. And that's what makes the story of Edward the Great so great. As with the rest of Season 8, most sets used are just typical green landscapes and a little boring after a while. This is a problem with most of the era as a whole, but I'll let it slide as this was the first season to use this type of scenery. It mainly becomes a problem as the series continues, and is also an issue in later eras like the Miller and even Brenner eras, though there are some fun new locations every once in a while. The new one for this episode is the Duke and Duchess's summer house.
My ultimate summer getaway, complete with water slide.
What?
As for the music, it's pretty good. I mean, it doesn't sound nearly as good as the classic themes, but it's alright. The score was composed by Robert Hartshorn, and this was one of his first seasons on the show. I want to briefly mention the part as Edward climbs the hill. I love this bit where it goes from slow and dreary to quick and hopeful. The story was written by Abby Grant, who was also responsible for the highlights of Percy and the Oil Painting and It's Good to Be Gordon, but also the disappointments of War and Peace and Thomas and the Big Bang. You win some, you lose some, I guess. The episode was directed by Stephen Asquith, an assistant director to David Minton in the classic seasons. There's also some stock footage in the opening from Gordon and Spencer. On the side of narration, we once again have Michael Brandon and Michael Angelis.
Well done, Edward, he called. You are a credit to the railway.
Edward was so happy his boiler tingled. He found puff he never knew he had.
Well done, Edward, he called. You are a credit to the railway.
Edward was so happy his boiler tingled. He found puff he never knew he had.
Angelis' performance in Season 8 wasn't nearly as good as it was in Season 3 and 5. As for Brandon, many people have been coming around to his performance in Season 8. I mean, I have had a few comments about this on my Gordon and Spencer analysis. And as he was the one I grew up with, my hit era bias obviously goes to Brandon. Hit episodes and his voice are just stuck together for me, while Angelis was a lot better in previous seasons. To sum up then, much of the hit era's uniform style and the stories are clear in this episode's presentation. But while I don't think it was intentional, I really liked how consistent this episode could be with its characters from the former seasons. Except James, who I guess forgot Edward saved him. There are a lot of references and nods to previous episodes, as well as the accidental prediction of Edward and Henry's fate. But overall, I would say that Edward the Great lives up to his name, and it's definitely a standout episode of the season. If you haven't already, I suggest you give this one a watch. But now tell me, what are your thoughts on this episode? Were those moments of continuity just happy accidents? Am I looking too far into this to justify my nostalgia? Please tell me about it in the comments. But that's all for today. I'll see you in the next video, and in the meantime, stay really useful.